Welcome to the Leadership for Society Speaker Series. This year's theme is Tensions, Business, Civic Society, and Politics. And I'm Brian Lowery, professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. And today I'm speaking with Rachel Peric, Executive Director of Welcome America, a nonprofit leading a movement of inclusive communities becoming more prosperous by ensuring everyone belongs, including immigrants. Thanks, Rachel, for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. It's great to be here.
Great. So let me start by asking you, what do you think are the greatest barriers to successful integration of immigrants into communities?
Well, maybe we can just step back for a minute to define that term integration, because sometimes it's a contentious one. But I think really what we're talking about is how do we make it possible for everyone in a community to really thrive, to be part of the community, to belong. And some of the work that we've done here at Welcoming America has been to really look at what communities have done successfully to make that happen, both for immigrants and also for people who maybe have been in communities for generations. And what we've learned from working with communities over the last 15 years is that there's a lot that communities can be doing that starts with just the individual relationships we have with our neighbors and making sure that people are really connecting to one another at a human level, all the way to reducing barriers that people might face to getting involved civically in their community, maybe becoming a U.S. citizen if they're eligible to do that, learning English, finding jobs, the kinds of opportunities that, for all of us are important to be a successful and thriving person in our society.
That's great. I'm happy you raised that because when I said integration, I should be clear that what I meant is how do you make sure that people live in a community, right? And that people thrive in a community. So my next question was, in fact, what does successful integration of communities look like? So when I say integration, I don't have any particular thing in mind. So I don't mean assimilation necessarily to some existing cultural practices, but I kind of want to know what you think it looks like for a community to thrive when you have people from different places or different cultural backgrounds.
Well, I think a lot of us, when we hear the term immigration, are kind of prompted by the overall narrative that's out there to think of maybe some of the challenges that communities are facing in making sure that really people are not being scapegoated or discriminated against. And those things are really important right now in our society. I think, when my own family came here as refugees in the late 1940s, one of the things that was really meaningful to them was this American ideal that you could be from anywhere in the world and call yourself an American. And I think, really at the end of the day, that's sort of the underpinning of it. We want, to live in communities that live up to that value, where, we can live into this very American notion, whether we've been successful at it or not. But this American notion that, regardless of our race or origin, gender, ability, all of these things, that we can live together as neighbors. And we can get into some of the nitty gritty of how communities do that and what it takes to make that happen. But for us, it's really about translating those values into policies and practices in a community to make that possible.
Great. So right now you talked about the dominant narrative currently, and I want to think a little bit about that dominant narrative. And I recognize that the dominant narrative about immigration doesn't necessarily capture the reality of what's going on the ground, but it does capture how a lot of people think about what's happening, right? So I'm curious if you were to point to the most compelling or the strongest arguments currently being made against immigration, what are those arguments and how would you respond to them?
Well, I think a lot of them root back to a couple of core ideas, and we can call this a disinformation campaign. But one of them goes back to what I was just saying about what it means to be an American. Who gets to call themselves an American? What does it mean to belong? And I think, since our founding, we've always been in this push and pull between this idea of American in the most expansive and inclusive way possible, and an American that is limited to whiteness or limited to, a certain set of characteristics. And immigration has always been part of that larger debate about, what it means to define yourself as American. So that's sort of one of the dominant narratives. And then another one that I think we probably hear a lot these days is that, immigration is sort of chaos, that we don't have enough to go around, and therefore we need to be reducing the number of people. And in fact, I think what we see every day in communities is that, immigration is actually going quite well, and with a certain set of practices and policies, we can be more abundant in the way that we think about incorporating new people. And, people have moved since the beginning of time. It's a natural thing to migrate. More people are going to be migrating, just with a more globalizing economy and also with the impacts of climate change. And so we don't have to be caught in that kind of scarcity narrative. I think we have it within our power to plan for an immigration that works well, that doesn't have to be chaos, and isn't really tied into not only the narratives, but kind of the political agendas of maintaining immigration as something that isn't functional, because that's a good way to win elections.
I'm happy to you went to the politics of it, and so I'd like to ask you to think about what policies and programs do you think should be or need to be implemented to promote a more successful say, immigration experience. So for the country, not just for us. I just want to be clear when I say that. I don't just mean for the immigrants that are coming in, but for the communities that are there that are benefiting from or accepting these immigrants into the community as well. What kind of policies and programs do you think are necessary for that to work well?
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that you set up the question that way, because I think, immigration policies have to serve, two interests, which I think at the end of the day share an interest, which are, people who are already call themselves American in the case of the United States, people who already call ourselves American, and new people arriving. So we need an immigration system that works for everyone and serves all of those interests. So let's just set that as kind of the foundation. And I think, most people would agree that making it easier to come here, making it easier to access legal status, access citizenship, serves all of those interests. And all of that is kind of encompassed in the idea of what's really needed now, which is comprehensive immigration reform. So updating our federal immigration laws, which haven't been updated in a very long time. And then our focus at Welcoming America, especially in this moment when our politics haven't really allowed for that to happen, and in fact have prevented that from happening, is what is it within the power of communities to do from a policy standpoint to make sure that the experience of people arriving here and of communities is, as positive as it can be, that we're keeping everyone safe, that we're making it possible for, people to feel that sense of belonging, so that they can become active participants in American society, put down roots, just as my family did. So those kinds of things we've encompassed in something that we call the welcoming standard. And it starts with really building what we think of as a kind of infrastructure in communities. So a function within local government that's thinking about how to incorporate new Americans or new people in communities, the sort of healthy civic infrastructure to make sure that the voices of residents are really being heard in that process. And then policies like making it easier to access services or access information, maybe in a language that you're most comfortable speaking in, being able to start and grow a business, get involved in your kids' school and education. There's a lot of people who have immigrant backgrounds now in the United States who, maybe have come here as a doctor or a nurse, or, have experience in another profession that are working as cab drivers is sort of the most famous example of that. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but, we want people to be able to translate those skills and capacities into the jobs that they're doing now. So really trying to bring down the barriers to make it possible for for everyone to thrive.
Yeah, so I think that raises an interesting tension because you see a lot of concern about how low the barriers already are. Like, I mean, from people who have concerns about the rates of immigration or people that they see as trying to enter the country. And we can talk a little bit about who they perceive those people to be. I'm going to set that aside for a second. And when you talk about making it easier, where do you draw the line, or how do you draw the line? Presumably, a line is going to be drawn somewhere, right? You assume, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that there'd be a sense that there are borders and there should be some management of that. How do you think about making services more available, making it easier for people to become um, productive citizens of their community, and also maintaining some degree of order with the way immigration works in this country?
Well, maybe I can share a couple of examples of places that are working to become welcoming, because I think that kind of grounds us in their reality, and then come back a little bit to that question. Because I think, these ideas get really theoretical really fast, and I just think it's helpful to kind of share where communities are at. And maybe just to start, because, being Stanford, I kind of want to start local and just give the example of a city like San Jose, which we've worked with for a number of years. And, what happened in San Jose and a lot of parts of the country where you had, a growing economy, people moving and migrating in, the there's sort of a celebration of the diversity, and a recognition of how important that is, especially in a place like Silicon Valley, to an innovation economy. And yet, people arrive and they're not really able to thrive in the way that they could be if some of those barriers are being brought down. So San Jose went through a whole process of working with the community to say, what would it look like for us to be a more welcoming place? How can we begin to bring down some of those barriers? And then when COVID hit, that work was really essential, because had they not really focused on making sure that public health information or the vaccine was accessible, there would have been a lot of people that otherwise would have been left out or excluded from that. So I share that example because I think it's so easy to get pulled into that narrative of immigration not working and lose sight of how much really important work there is to make sure that people who are already here, are experiencing, the ability to really, reach their full potential, which in turn is about a community reaching its full potential. And then another great example, we work with a lot of communities who've been experiencing population decline. So there's this narrative like too many people is a problem, but in fact, actually, we've got an aging population in this country, and a declining population in a number of cities. That's a really urgent situation, because you have an infrastructure that was built for many more people, and now people have left. So kind of our Rust Belt cities, if you will. So a city like Dayton, Ohio, which was one of the first in the country to create a welcoming plan, and then to become certified as a welcoming city. That work started, I think, for deeply values-based reasons, but they also had this trajectory of about 50 years of population decline that they were able to turn around by building a more welcoming community, and really, being able to grow their population as a result of that. So, I think so much of the conversation on immigration is really dominated by this idea that has been seeded by the far right that says, we need to close ourselves in. And of course, we should have, the ability as a nation to establish a border. Of course, we should, be able to have a reasonable immigration policy. But from my perspective, we're not talking enough about how to grow our population. And I think, a lot of communities can benefit when they're able to reframe the conversation from a position of how do we build our capacity, not how do we expel people as quickly as possible.
And so, I'm going to push on this a little bit. So, I think we're more or less, we're probably kind of aligned, more or less, in terms of the political views we have about this. But I think it's a reasonable position to say how many immigrants can a community successfully, for whatever reasons, not make no judgments, how many can they integrate, right? So if you have an existing population and you bring in a new population, it's common that there are tensions, right? And so I understand your work is how do you ease those tensions so every constituent in that community, the newcomers and the people who were there, like benefit from the shift. But there has to be some, I assume, in your mind, some reasonable rate of integrating newcomers, whoever those people are. And so when you think about the policies of immigration, should we worry about making it, I know this is, I see where you might go with this, but should we worry about making it too easy to come in? Is that not a concern? Are you're not worried that it creates tensions that then make it harder to successfully create these welcoming communities?
I think too easy to come. I think there's sort of two questions at play. There's the question of who gets to come in and what happens when people arrive.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, what we've actually done with our immigration system is make it relatively easy for people to come and relatively difficult to become an American. And what I mean by that is it's not an accident that we have the large population of people that don't have legal status that we do. It's very challenging, I think, to maintain a democracy when you have an immigration policy that's so in conflict with the values of being a democracy, which is that we should all have equal status. And yet there's this huge benefit from having, a workforce that isn't ever able to operate on an equal playing field from the average American. And because of that, it feels so unfair. How did we get here? So I guess what I'm saying is I think we need to challenge some of the underlying assumptions that we make about these questions of, is it too much? Is it too easy? Because the real challenge is not that so many people are coming here, although lots of people want to come here, and I think that's a good thing. It means that we're doing something right. I think we would be very concerned if a lot of people didn't want to come here. I think the deeper question for us to be asking ourselves is, when people get here, how do we want to make sure that they're treated, and what do we need to do to, stay true to the values that, at least in theory, this country was founded on, and again, in many instances has struggled to live up to.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a bit like the workforce. So I want to shift a little bit and think about business. What's the role of private industry or business, do you think, in making immigration work, or in creating problems? Like, what do you think what's the role they currently play in your mind? And is that consistent with the role you think would be most productive for the country?
I think, like many Americans, there's kind of a spectrum of perspectives, but also, like most Americans, I think businesses by and large have been supportive of federal immigration reform. So you have, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and many of our, Fortune 500 companies, and many small businesses too, very supportive of reforming our immigration laws, and also very supportive of work in communities, because for them, this is a huge question of talent attraction and retention. I can't bring my business to a community and be able to attract and keep people in that community if, when folks arrive, their kids are getting bullied in school, because of their background, or they don't want to stay. So in a lot of parts of the country, businesses, chambers of commerce have been some of the fiercest, supporters of the work to build more welcoming communities, because they understand how connected it is to their bottom line. There's also a ton of research around kind of the entrepreneurial aspects of, being an immigrant. And, some of that is because immigrants are locked out of other kinds of job opportunities. But in a positive way, immigrants have been really the driving force of Main Street businesses over the last couple of decades. So just about all of the growth of Main Street business in the U.S. has been driven by by immigrant entrepreneurs. Again, not because immigrants are like some special unicorns or anything like that, but so much of the just entrepreneurial act of immigrating and wanting to rebuild a life, and really, the drive to do that, and and also to be locked out of other formal systems has been behind that. And I think that's, our choice, whether to kind of harness that or to leave it aside. And I think a lot of businesses understand that that's really, a huge source of innovation and growth for the American economy, and something that we should be tapping into even more.
Mm-hmm. So in this conversation, we've talked about immigrants as a population. So you say they're great. I mean, there's actually research on this. They're more entrepreneurial, and you kind of talk to some reasons as to why that would be. But there are very different kinds of populations of immigrants. So how do you think about these different populations and their experiences? So they're refugees, they're highly skilled workers that are coming in to do what they've been trained to do elsewhere. They're undocumented, people without documentation who are here. Like, I think when we talk about immigrants, people have an image of a particular person in mind, and it's probably not someone who's coming from Ireland to work at Google. That's probably not the image they have in mind of an immigrant, even though that person also obviously is an immigrant. Help us think about the different populations. How would you break down the different populations of immigrants, and what's the major, in your mind, distinction between those populations?
Well, I think some of the distinction, has to do with origin, race, class, some of the things you kind of already brought into the conversation. And some of the distinctions have to do with the category of immigration status that they hold, which, in the case of a refugee or an asylum seeker, has to do with what drove them to come, being displaced from their own country because of, war, or, they don't have a country to return to, or maybe because they were a political activist and they're seeking asylum here. And some people are coming for, employment and job opportunities, or maybe to reunite with a family member. And we have, lots of different classes of immigration status that correspond to that, all of which need updating, because we've made it very difficult, actually, for people to come here with legal status. So there's huge waiting lists, based on country of origin. For example, if you're in Mexico and you have family members here, it could take 20 years before you're granted the ability to come. So in part because of that, that creates a kind of push factor for people to come in other ways, maybe through our asylum system. And that's what we're seeing right now with some of what's happening on the southern border. So, I think the United States doesn't exist in a vacuum. Obviously, so much of geopolitics also factors into who's coming to the United States and why. So, with the war in Ukraine, or with the American pullout from Afghanistan, we saw large numbers of people coming from Afghanistan and Ukraine. And unfortunately, in those situations, we granted them a very temporary form of status. So there's a lot of work happening now to remedy that. A lot of people who came to the United States 20, 30 years ago from places like El Salvador are still on a kind of temporary form of status. So, the biggest factors that actually impact whether people can thrive here, are things like whether they, have a form of status that's more than temporary, so that they can stay and invest and put down roots. And also, of course, we can't leave out race and the impact of that on people's experiences as Americans.
Mm-hmm. And so every country has some immigration policy. Are there countries that you think do it more successfully than we do? And if so, what are they doing differently than we are?
Well, what's interesting about this moment in history is, historically, the United States or other kind of, sort of post-colonial societies have been receiving destinations for immigrants. So like Australia, for example. I think what has been particular about the United States, again, is this sort of ethos that you can be from anywhere in the world and call yourself an American. And in various waves of American history, we've had, very open door policies, and then shut the door and then open the door back up. But I think that that's, somewhat unique in the world. And at the same time, I think we've seen, places like Germany who had, 1 million people come in 2015, and I think went through the experience of trying to incorporate them, with a lot of challenges, but also I think with some good political leadership that said, we can do this. Angela Merkel, famous lines that, we got this, we can do this. And I think, for better or for worse, that has not been the dominant narrative in the United States from our national political leaders, but it has been the dominant narrative from a lot of our local mayors and elected officials. And what I have seen in this work, because we work with partners all over the world, is that all over the world, there are cities and towns, even when there isn't, very strong immigration policy at a national level, there's really amazing work happening at a local level to incorporate people. So we do some work with New Zealand and Australia, and there's some really incredible work happening there to not only incorporate people, but really reconcile that work with Indigenous communities, which I think is really powerful and something that we don't do particularly well here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to leave people with one thing, so let's say there's some people who are very much in agreement with you already. I think immigration is a boon to America. I'm probably in that camp. And there are people who are skeptical, right? That maybe we're not paying enough attention to immigration. We're letting in too many people, or letting in the wrong people, or the wrong kinds of people. If you wanted to speak to that latter group, what would you want to leave them with as they think about immigration going forward?
I just, as you were saying that, I was just thinking about the time that I spent last week visiting small town Minnesota. We have a really amazing member there that's been doing some work in the community. And, I think for me, regardless of, how we feel about our federal immigration policies or what the, perfect number of people is, I think most of us would agree, and this is really what I saw and experienced being in Minnesota, that, for people who are here now, for people who are our neighbors, that our neighbors are our community. And I think, most Americans, regardless of our politics, or even regardless sometimes of our views on immigration, at a human level and at a neighbor level, want to see their neighbors belong, and also want to belong themselves. And I think that's why the politics of immigration can be so fraught. It's very hard to be welcoming when you yourself also don't feel welcome in a community, or you're experiencing your community is changing and don't know what your place is in that. So, I think a lot of the work that's happening in communities is really about kind of getting behind some of the binaries of the immigration debate, or sort of pitting people against each other, and really saying, like, what does it mean for us to live together in this community and be neighbors? How can we build this community together? We're here. I'm here. You're here. What does it mean for both of us to belong, to raise our kids here, to make sure that they can really thrive? And I think that gives me a lot of hope right now. All of us know that immigration is a polarized and polarizing issue, like many others. But I think when we get down to that human level and really that neighbor level, I think that there's a lot of consensus and agreement.
Well, I hope we can harness that consensus and agreement and come to agree on some better policies. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. It's been great to be with you.